Welcome back to this video series about this Vue, Vuetify, and Firebase project where we're building this dev meetup application. Thus far, we're in the state, or we have the project in the state where we're able to actually view meetups in the carousel, click on one, see the details, and that's it. We're managing this state through Vuex already, which is great. But I think a nice next step would be if we could actually organize a new meetup. Even though it won't be stored on the server just yet, this would be a nice enhancement to actually really create our own meetup. So let's implement this now. I now want to make this organized meetup page work. And for that, I need a form. So let's start by having a look at the Vuetify documentation and actually see what they offer us when it comes to inputs to text fields. And there are text fields components which give us nice inputs for single line and multi-line inputs. And the nice thing is this also has validation built in. So we also get validation errors depending on which rules we configured, which is really awesome, and I will come back to that. So I'm going to use a bunch of these text fields now to allow the user to create at least a first version of a new meetup. We're going to enhance this later once we add Firebase to upload files and so on, but we can go pretty far without Firebase already. So let's go back and let's go to the create_meetup.vue file or page here, which is actually the page we load when we click on organize a meetup. There I'll again add a Vue container to use the Vuetify grid and a Vue layout row. Now here I'll add a Vue flex element, access 12, and that's all stuff you already know. In there, I'll now add a heading where I say create a new meetup, so that we simply have a title telling us what we're doing. Or maybe H4, that's really big. So create a new meetup, and I maybe give this a text color of primary -- text, like that. So create a new meetup. Now we load that, I'll add a new row, so a new Vue layout with a row, and in there, Vue flex. Now, however, this Vue flex will get access 12. In there, I'll add a form element. I'll remove the action because I don't want to send a request to the server or anything like that. I'll handle the submission through Vue.js. Now in there, I'll add another Vue layout, a row. And now here a Vue flex element, full width on very small devices, on bigger devices only half the width maybe, and therefore offsetting it too. And now I'll add a Vue text field element here. That is a component provided by Vuetify. And the Vue text field component takes a name like normal HTML inputs do. Could be title, since I want to fetch the title here. It takes a label where we can define some placeholder text we'll actually see, or some nice label attached next to it. Then an ID maybe of title. And I also want to add required, and this will use the built-in validation to show us when this is wrong. If we go back now, here we see the input field. If I click in that and I type there, you see now it's valid, but if I remove that, we get an indication that this is invalid, which is really nice. Would also be nice if that title here at the top would be kind of, well, aligning to our input fields. We can achieve this by simply adding SM6 and the same offset here at the top too, so that we get the same styling on different devices, which looks really nice in my opinion. And maybe we change this from the primary text to the secondary text here. Or therefore remove it altogether, since that should be the default anyways. So now that is the title added, we also need the date, we need the location, we need a description, we need an image. These are all things we definitely need. So what I'll do is, I'll go back to the application, replicate this, add another row, now not with the title, but with the location. I want to allow the users to simply enter that here. So that's also required input. Now we got 2 lines here, really simple. And then I want to allow the user to enter an image. Now I'll soon add an upload button here because we will actually upload an image to Firebase, but we haven't added Firebase yet. So for now, people should simply enter a URL here. So I'll name this image URL. And here image URL like that. Let's give this an ID of image dash URL maybe. So now we got this too. Here we got a tiny bug that the line is not displayed at all times. Sometimes that happens in Vuetify, really strange. I'll next add another row where I want to allow the user to enter a description. So here that will be the description. Let's add this here too. Here also a description. And the description should be a multi-line text field. And we can do this or add this by adding multi-line here. This will now ensure that we actually have multiple lines to write, and we can even increase this if we want. Now, when using multi-line, if you have a look at the text fields documentation here, just scroll down, multi-line here, you will see that you can actually also restrict how many lines you want to allow. Well, all the way at the bottom actually. There's a lot about validation here too, so feel free to dive much deeper into that. Now here, what you can do is, if you use multi-line, you can also use rows to define how many rows you want to display. I'll stick to the default of 5, but you could override this. That's just something I want to bring to your attention. And as you can see, there are loads of properties you can use to adjust validation and how that all is displayed. So definitely feel free to play around with that. So that's the multi-line validation. Back to the image, I believe it would also be nice if you would see a preview of the image, maybe below it. So here I'll not add a text field, but actually I simply want to add an image property, normal image element actually, where I want to output my image preview maybe, or image URL. This is a property which doesn't exist yet, but I'll soon add properties to it. I'll bind all these inputs. Now I'll come back to date and time later. Let's work with the inputs we got thus far. And let's add a script section to this file now, so that we can actually bind all these inputs to properties. So export a default object here. And there I now want to have my, my data property for now. And in data, I will return an object. And in that object, I'll have my title, which is an empty string initially. I'll have my location, which is an empty string initially. I'll have my image URL, which is an empty string, and the description. So all the things I configured up here as text fields, now we can use vmodel on the title to bind to title. And that's using normal Vue.js syntax here again, nothing Vuetify specific, except for the fact that the vTextField component allows us to use vmodel on it. But vmodel is then just normal Vue.js code. And I'll do the same here on the location and on the image URL here, and also on the description. And this is the important part, which allows us to fetch the values the user actually enters. With that fetched, there's one other thing we can of course do. We can add another wheel layout towards the end of the form. It should be a row, vflex xs12 maybe, and there I now want to have a vButton where I actually say create meetup. I'll give this button a class of primary. Now if you have a look, we see the button at the bottom. Make sure to also give it SM6 offset SM3 to have it sit nicely in the middle here. Now that button should not be enabled if the form is invalid, and I'll come back to checking this. For now, this is the form how it looks like. Let's see how we can enhance this with validation and actually using the values we enter here to create a new meetup. I want to start with validation. The button should only be clickable if the whole form is valid, which it currently, for example, is not. For that, I'll go back to my JavaScript object here and add the computed property to that component instance. And I'll add a form is valid computed property here. Let's add a blank space there. Now here, I want to return if this title is not equal to an empty string and this location is not equal to an empty string. So basically that all of them are valid all these inputs. And you can, of course, define your own validation logic here, or use another Vue validation package like vvalidate to get other ways of handling this. So here I'll then also check if the image URL is not empty, and finally if the description is not empty. So I'm checking if all these fields do have the values I expect them to have, not being empty and so on. Let me put this over multiple lines to make it look a bit nicer. So that's my validation logic. And now I can use form is valid here or on my button to bind to the disabled property. And if that is true, the button is disabled. So if not, form is valid, so this computed property where I return this Boolean check, if that's not true, then this will be disabled. And that will be not true if the form is not valid, which is what I want. So now what you see is it is indeed disabled here. As soon as I do enter something into all of these fields though, it gets enabled. As you can see, image preview, of course, not working here. If I were to use my own image, like for example from Munich, which is the city I'm living in, if I now choose an image here, like this one, for example, get that URL then, this one. Now if I enter this here, you should see that we indeed get a nice preview. Well, that is rather large here, so maybe we should do something about the styling. Validation, however, is working. Let's fix the image styling then, now that we already see that it's an issue. We can fix that relatively easy. On the preview image I'm using here, I'll simply set the height to 300. We do that, now you see it ensures that this doesn't go super big. On small devices, it's still an issue though, so maybe we go even smaller than that, 200. Now it should also be fine, not entirely fine on small devices, I guess. Better though. You can of course also use responsive CSS to control the size here. I'll just try to get a quick fix for that. Now that looks better. So this would now be the setup I'll use here. Now I want to make the create meetup button work. I want to make sure that whatever I enter here, once it is valid, I can submit it, and I do add it to my Vuex store. Now for that, I'll go back to the Vuex store and add a mutation here. Create meetup seems to be a fitting name. There, I'll actually get the state and the payload as arguments. And in the mutation, I expect to get a payload which already is an object formatted in the way I want to have it formatted. Now that's not a strict requirement. You could also reformat the content you get and make sure that you create the object you want to save in the mutation. So both is valid. Here, I'll actually just set state and reach out to my loaded meetups here and actually simply push my new meetup, which again will be in the payload already formatted in the way I need it. So I'll push it onto my loaded meetups. So in actions here, I'll also add a create meetup method. There I can get this object where I use destructuring to extract the commit method. I'll also get my payload here as a second argument. That will be the meetup I actually want to create. Here, I'll now create my meetup object, and I'll set the title. I expect to get a title property in the payload, and I'll have to make sure that my application works like this. But since you're the one configuring the store, that's something you can control. So here, title shall be payload title, location shall be payload location, the image URL shall be payload image URL, and the description shall be payload description. And correctly, you would say, well, if I'm extracting all these properties, which have the exact same names as in the object I create, why don't I just take payload as the actual object? And you would be right. If that is how your application works, and it certainly is the case for our application, there's nothing wrong with doing that. I'm just showing the more verbose way of actually mapping this to a new object to make sure that you understand that you could transform it here. You could also build it up in mutations, as I just said, in this method here. I chose this method and I'll create the meetup here because payload might also have other properties which I don't need, or maybe other property names which I don't want to use here. So that's why I choose the more work both way. It's not about getting done as fast as possible here, but also teaching you a little bit about Vuex, I guess. So that's the meetup. I'm not using it yet though. Now here we would actually reach out to Firebase and store it. That would be the idea at this point here. And once we did store it, we would get back an ID Firebase created, and we will add this ID to the meetup. And that's all stuff we will do once we added Firebase. We got a lot of work to do then. We'll also upload the image here and get the storage path in Firebase and store that. All not stuff we have to worry about right now. So I will simply commit here. I will commit and execute create meetup, passed as a string. And as a payload, I will pass my meetup so that I can simply push that onto my loaded meetups array. And all our getters will then automatically fetch the updated version of that array. So that is the create meetup action I created. Now back in the create meetup component, I want to fire that action whenever I click my button here. However, this button should actually submit the form. Remember, we're still in a form object. So the better way of handling this is to give this V button a type of submit, and then go to the form, and there I'll add a @submit_listener. Submit is a native DOM event and we can listen to it. It will occur once you click a button which is of type submit. Here, I then want to prevent the default, which would be to send a HTTP request. I don't want to do that. I don't want to leave my single page application here. And then I'll call on create meetup, or any method name you want to use. So with that, let's go down to our object. Let's add methods here. And let's add on create meetup as a method here. Now I don't need to get any arguments here because I got all the values here. And in on create meetup, I now will simply dispatch my action. So this store dispatch. And now I'll actually create my meetup data object, choose any name you like, where I will simply bind this title to this title, then location to this location. So I'll basically create a JavaScript object where I store all the data I stored in my data property here. So image URL, this image URL, and that will be what I pass to my store then. So description to this description, like that. And here I'll simply dispatch my create meetup action and pass the meetup data to that action. That is what I'll do here. Now again, once we add a date and time, which we haven't added yet, this will become more complex. For now, what I want to do is I will indeed add a date here and simply set new date to get the current date. So right now, go back to the store to also handle that. So here I'll actually then also store date and payload date. And with that, we get a very easy way without date and time pickers, without Firebase, without image upload, but a very easy way of adding new meetups. For now, we will enhance this, no worries. So with that, let's see if it works. Let's go back to our application here. Let me fetch this link again. Let's say Munich, JavaScript meetup. Location will be at the Marienplatz in Munich. Always a great place to meet if you don't want to find someone because it's crowded with people. Then I'll add my image URL here to get the preview, and it'll certainly be an awesome meetup. Let me hit create meetup. Did it work? Well, we don't know. Let's view the meetups. Looks good to me. We got the Munich JavaScript meetup. The date is displayed a bit strange here because I simply used new date and we have no way of properly outputting dates. I can now view the meetup here. And there we got an error because cannot read a property title of undefined because we have no ID. We try to fetch a meetup by ID when we load the individual meetup, but when we create one, we don't have one. Now I told you that we will get one from Firebase once we send our data there, but that doesn't happen yet. So for now, and again, it's only a temporary solution, when we create a meetup here, I'll store an ID, which is hard-coded into the store. Of course, not a production-ready solution, but it'll do for now. So with that, let's go back to organizing a meetup here. Let's reload the page. Munich, JavaScript meetup it was, at the Marienplatz in Munich. Let's enter our image here, and it'll be an awesome meetup like that. Let's create it again. Let's go back to Vue Meetups, click on it. Now we see it here. Now there is stuff to improve. For example, that we actually maybe navigate away if we click the create meetup button, that we have date and time pickers, that we use Firebase. The last thing I'll do in this video is I'll make sure that we navigate to the list of meetups once we click create, but we'll take care about the pickers and so on in future videos too, of course. So let's make that create meetup button work correctly, or to be precise, once we submit the meetup here, I want to do the right thing. First of all, I'll add a little check. If this form is valid, if that is not true, by adding an exclamation mark, I want to return, because I don't want to submit the form if the form is invalid. We shouldn't be able to reach this code anyways, since we disabled the button. But on the other hand, a user could just go into the DOM and remove the disabled flag, and then we would be able to reach that part. So it's a nice extra check. But more importantly, once we did this patch, I want to use the router, this $router, to use the injected router instance to push a new route and go to /meetups. You could also, of course, navigate to the newly created meetup. With that, let's go back to the application one final time. And let's add that Munich JavaScript meetup one more time. Still awesome. If I click create meetup now, I'm taken there. We see it here. Still see the old one due to hot reloading in our setup here. So the page wasn't actually reloaded. And now this all works. Of course, we now have the issue if we have two new meetups, they share the same ID because we hard-coded that into our Vuex store. We'll fix this, but in the next video, I want to dive into using date and time pickers to make sure we don't use the current date. And then I'll also take care about outputting the date in a nicer way and outputting the actual place and description. We also don't do that. So there is still a lot of work. Let's move on and start working on these issues in the next video.